Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a video about audio. This one is going to be kind of rambly. I can already feel it coming. Get yourself a beverage and kick back because this video is going to be about playing records on the air at a radio station. We're going to talk about radio station turntables and related technologies. I cannot simply talk about records on the radio because they were a big part of radio, but they worked hand in hand with other things. If you grew up listening to the radio in the 20th century, you heard records on the radio. You have heard the equipment I'm going to talk about in this video. I can guarantee it. This is not going to be any sort of definitive guide. It should not be considered a history. It's just me rambling on about my experiences and what I've learned over the years about playing records on the radio. This is a picture of me on the air at WFOS. WFOS at that time was owned by the city of Chesapeake, and it was run by the Chesapeake Public Schools. It was a public radio station that served the entire city. Unlike most high school stations, which are very low power, this one had enough power to be heard all over a very large, geographically large town that is. Chesapeake is not large, or wasn't at that time, wasn't large in population. Chesapeake, by the way, is right next to Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Portsmouth in the Hampton Roads area. WFOS was part of the Chesapeake Center for Science and Technology, which was a very progressive technical school that was available to high school students that had special interests. And they not only had radio, but they also had kind of the stuff you expect, like auto body, and they had mechanics. You wanted to become an auto mechanic. They had that there as well. They had cosmology. You could learn how to cut people's hair. There was a lot of different classes that were offered. If you wanted to know about radio, they had the radio station. They also had a cable TV channel called ACC 40, which we worked kind of hand in hand with a little bit. The radio and the television station really didn't mix too much, but every now and again it did. It depended on what they were doing. So this was a substantial operation, and I was blessed to be able to come there because I did not go to Chesapeake Public Schools. I lived in the neighboring town of Portsmouth, and my mom did some wangling because when I was about 14 years old, I decided that I really, really, really wanted to be in radio. It hit me that this is where I wanted to go. This was something I could do. And when I started going to WFOS in 1986, I was 15, and I wanted to learn engineering. I really wasn't keen on the air part of things at that time. I wanted to know what happened when you flip the switches and push the buttons and turn the knobs. You had to train to be on the air, though. You had to train for an FCC license. You had to get it because you were taking care of a transmitter, and at that time you needed to have a license, which I did. The on the air part for me was, at that time, me being able to play with the toys. I wanted to touch the equipment. I wanted to play the records. I wanted to do that. Over time, though, the first 2 years that I was there, I went for 3 years, which is crazy. Most people went for 2. It was a 2-year program. I actually tacked a year on because I juggled my classes around to be able to do this. And the first 2 years, I took engineering. After 2 years, I kind of realized that I was probably not the guy you'd want to call at 2 o'clock in the morning to go fix your transmitter because it went off the air and it's up on the side of this mountain, and oh, by the way, we're in the middle of an ice storm. I was not keen on that idea. The RF side of things, which stands for radio frequency, was not something that I was terribly interested in. I found out that I was more interested in the on-air things, doing things on the air, and working in the studio. So I changed my classes to where I came back for a 3rd year, and for that 3rd year I did a special programming class where I kind of followed Dennis McCurdy, the program director, around. And I wanted to learn everything I could learn about being on the air and being a program director. At that time, I thought that was the direction that I should go, which I did. And I did manage to become a program director at a lot of radio stations through the years. So I did learn something, and I actually used what I learned when I got out into the real world. Isn't that crazy? The really cool thing about being at WFOS was that the radio stations in town in the Hampton Roads area would donate stuff to us. We got a lot of their old equipment. And so what you kind of see in the studio here is some of it's a hodgepodge of things that were donated. And there was much more than this elsewhere. So it was a really kind of a neat learning experience because all this old stuff would show up and we'd go, what is this? How does it work? And we'd figure out ways to put it together. We had 3 studios at one point in a very small, by the way, mobile classroom double-wide trailer thing. There were 2 of them with a hallway between them when I first got there. Later, they added a 3rd, and then much later, I actually worked as an engineer part-time at WFOS and built some new studios in the main building at the tech center there in Chesapeake, and we moved out of the portable classrooms. But we had all this stuff, and we would just try and figure out how to piece it together and do something with it. So actually, some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video I learned there and picked up through the years. This video should not be considered as any sort of definitive guide or a history or anything. This is my experience, this is what I know, and it's going to be a ramble, and we're going to talk about scratching on the air, playing records, man. That sound. If you grew up in the 20th century, you know what that sounds like. It was powerful. And today, of course, in radio, everything is all digitized, and I say what we do is really feed a robot because we have this central automation system that everything talks to, and you just feed the audio into it as a digital file, and yeah, when it comes out on the air, it's crystal clear, and it's perfectly balanced and all that stuff, but if you grew up listening, you know what I'm talking about back in the 20th century. This is not a video that I actually thought about doing, mainly because I don't think a lot of people are going to watch this. And so that's one of the reasons I'm just going to sit here and chat. I'm not going to try and overproduce this, but this is just sort of a labor of love. This is something that I grew up loving and I still love. And the idea to do it now came from a comment that was posted on a rather old video called Budget Phono Cartridge Shootout 2018, where I was expounding about the very cool Audio-Technica AT3600L cartridge. And I got this comment, and for those of you who are not paying attention to the screen and are just listening, I will read it for you. This is from Beerster, B-E-A-R-S-T-E-R. So I'm going to say that Beerster or Bearster. I'm not really sure. Anyway, thank you for the tip to get an AT3600. Even though you've made some great videos on radio stations and about turntable setup at radio stations, I wondered if you considered making a video that goes into even more detail on radio station turntable setups. What models of turntables were used in the 1980s? Did most stations supply their own plinths? And were the tone arms usually a different brand than the turntable? Were there turntables from the 60s or 70s that were so good they stayed on the air through the 1980s? I'm going to answer your questions, and I'm going to do it happily because I love this stuff. So thank you so much for sending that in. I don't care if 3 people watch this video. This one's going to be fun for me to do. So let's get scratching on the air. I just love this thumbnail. So, when you think about radio, especially if you grew up in the 70s, you probably remember watching WKRP in Cincinnati. For those of you who are outside of the U.S., this was a television show that aired on the CBS television network from 1978 to 1982. WKRP got more people interested in doing radio probably than anything else you can think of because they made it look like so much fun. And here we have Dr. Johnny Fever sitting in the studio at WKRP, and he is looking at a very large turntable. Those are 12-inch records on a 16-inch platter. These are 16-inch turntables, which were common in radio stations up until, I guess, Actually, these turntables that you're looking at would not have been in a radio station at this time. These kind of fell to the wayside in the 1960s. Okay, and we'll get into why that was. WKRP, like just about every other movie and television show made about radio, got so much wrong as far as the technical side of it and what it looked like. Like, for instance, if you remember watching the show, Johnny would grab the microphone and move it. We don't do that. You never touch a microphone while you're on the air. The other thing is that this board is a hodgepodge. Somebody made it. Nothing ever looked like that. And I've never seen a board in my life with a phone on it. And behind him, you see the tape recorders. There's a mock-up of what looks like a cart machine above this box that has you see the faders are all up and has 3 meters on it. I don't know what that's supposed to be. So this is what they thought radio would look like. Apparently, the creator of the show spent about a week at WQST in Atlanta before they did the show, and this was his impression, and this is what he wanted on the air. So it is what it is. But the actual stuff they talk about on WKRP is very real, and the stories are very true to life, things that actually happened in radio stations. So I can get around the fact that it's not technically correct. The only movie that I have ever seen, and I've seen a lot of movies that involve radio stations, where they got it right, was American Graffiti. That looked real. And I guess that's because they had Wolfman Jack in there, who is a very famous disc jockey here in the United States. Most people know who Wolfman Jack is. Wolfman Jack, by the way, started his radio career in the Hampton Roads radio market at a station called WYOU in Hampton. And he was very much influenced by somebody you're going to see a picture of later on in this video, Bob Calvert. The Wolfman Jack character came from a character that Bob Calvert did called Baron Bebop back in 1955. This is all true. I met Wolfman Jack in 1992 at a special function honoring Bob Calvert in Virginia Beach. And he was a super nice guy. And I can tell you stories about Wolfman Jack, but we won't go there. We won't go there. I do know some things. So anyhow, this is what people thought radio looked like. The closest thing to what WKRP was in the television show would probably be something like this. This is Bill Bailey on the air at WAKY in Louisville, Kentucky. Yes, they called themselves Wacky. What a great radio station. And Bill Bailey was a fantastic radio personality. And we have the two most important things that you're going to find in a radio station, beyond the microphone. Of course, that's number one. In front of Bill, we have two Gates BC 500 turntables. And then behind him, you will see some ITC Criterion cart machines. And the cart machines played these tapes that might remind you a bit of an 8-track, but they are not 8-track tapes. When the television show WKRP came on the air, the truth of the matter is most radio stations in the United States, especially that played like a top 40 format or maybe a country format or adult contemporary, didn't play records on the air. They played tape. This is KTNQ 10Q in Los Angeles with the real Don Steele on the air, and you will notice that Don doesn't have a turntable near him. There's probably a turntable in this studio, but it would have been used on special occasions. Most of the music that you heard on KTNQ, which by the way was at 1020, and WAKY in Louisville was on 790. Keep that in mind. 790 will come back. We're talking about AM radio here. But anyway, 1020 KTNQ. You notice that he's got a lot of tapes and racks behind him, and those would be your commercials, your jingles, everything, except the guy on the air talking came off of a cart. So this was more typical when WKRP was on the air. This was what radio was like starting in the mid-70s. We have to take a detour here and talk about carts. And the reason why is because they are very important to the radio story. So if you're not interested at all in carts, and you just skip ahead until you see a turntable, and we'll get back on turntables. But this was a technology that I absolutely loved. And when carts first came along in the 1950s, they were used mainly for quick things on the air, like jingles. They were used for short commercials, stuff like that. And it made it so that one person could run a radio station and make all this noise on the air, and just in rapid succession, like boom, 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 boom. You didn't need to have a separate engineer who was sitting there queuing up records, which kind of before 1970, that's the way radio was in a lot of big markets, is that the talent sat in one room, and then you had an engineer who was lining everything up. And before tape came along on the air, especially cartridges, they were playing them off of records. They were playing transcriptions. We're going to talk a little bit about them later on in the video. But the cart machine really is what caused fast-paced top 40 radio of the 60s to happen. You wouldn't have had it without this technology. There wouldn't have been any way to do it. So a cart machine is really quite simple. This is an early one. This appears to be the early 60s. It's a tape caster. I think this was made by Broadcast Electronics, but I'm not really sure. Anybody who knows, you want to correct me. If I get something wrong, knock yourself out. Have fun. You're not going to hurt my feelings, because I want to know if I get it right too. These machines were very simple to use. You put the cartridge in the machine, and then you would play the button. You just push the button to play, and you'll notice that there's actually an eject button on this cart machine, and you'll also see that it looks like that you could put a much bigger cartridge in there. You could. Cartridges actually came in 3 sizes. NAB carts, they were called, or cartridges. You had the A size, which is what you're looking at here. The B was a little bit bigger. You could get more tape in it. And then the C size was really big. And the only time that you ever saw C-sized cartridges was in automation systems, where they had, you could put like a whole half-hour program on one of those cartridges. Like you could automate your entire Sunday morning, for instance. You'd have somebody who would have to sit there and dub all this stuff over to tape, and I've seen it done that way. And it could just all take care of itself. This was back before computer automation, by the way. We're talking about automation, which were big machines. That's out of the scope of this video, but I mean, I could do a video on automation if you wanted me to. So this is a more modern cart machine. This would be an ITC SP, International Tapetronics Corporation. These were kind of the standard in radio stations starting in the late 60s into the 70s, and definitely into the 80s and 90s. These machines were the ones to have in most radio stations. This particular machine, the SP, was introduced in 1973 or 74. I don't know which. But early 70s, right around there, and these were really high-quality machines. And you notice they're super simple. I mean, cart machines were almost completely idiot-proof. You have come on. There's a start button, there's a stop button, and that's it. Put the tape in, press play, and that's how it works. Now, I can tell just by looking at this machine that it is a stereo cart machine. This is for use on the air at a stereo radio station. And I can tell that by looking here at the head up top. I'm going to zoom in here and make this a little easier to see. We have 3 tracks. 1, 2, 3. This is a dummy head, by the way. This is just a player. This machine does not record. The top track would be your left channel. The middle track would be your right channel. And the bottom track is for Q tones. Carts had 3 basic Q tones. The first would be the trip tone or the stop tone, which was a kilohertz. 1 kilohertz, 1,000 cycles per second, was recorded onto the Q track where the tones were placed, and that was when you would record the cartridge. You would do that, and that way the machine would know when to stop. It would stop at the beginning of the message. It's an endless loop cartridge. And that also made it so you could have a long cart with lots of little jingles on it, and it would just rotate through them one at a time. Other tones on cartridges included the sec tone, or secondary tone, which was usually used to fire the next event. So when you would record the cartridge and you'd listen, and let's say the record was fading out or the commercial was ending, at the point you wanted the next thing to happen, the next cart to fire, you would push the secondary tone in. You would start recording it on the tape. You would keep recording that tone until whatever it was completely faded out, or long enough to where the system could detect that there was a beginning and an end to the tone. You didn't want a real quick one like boop. They had to be a little longer. They had to be like boop. And if it was like music, you'd hit it and you'd wait until you got it completely faded out, and then you'd let it go. Why? Because the beginning of the sec tone fired off the next event. The end of it would mute the channel. The cart machine would actually mute itself, so you didn't hear a whole bunch of blank tape hiss on the air, which there wasn't a lot of because it was pretty high quality, but that's how it worked. There was another tone in cart machines, and that was the tertiary tone. The tertiary tone was 8,000 cycles. Not a whole lot of radio stations used it, but when they did, it was usually there to light up a light in the studio that let somebody know, like when a song was playing, that, hey, you got about 30 seconds before you have to either talk or push a button or make sure that something's on the air. That's what the tertiary tone was for. The tones on stereo cart machines in particular would bleed into the right channel. So you may have been like listening to the radio with headphones years ago, and you heard this little at the end of a song, or maybe at the beginning you heard like a beep. And if they were using tertiary tones, I remember hearing those bleed in. So like about 30 seconds before the song was over, if there was a quiet part, you'd hear an 8,000 cycle tone, which is pretty high up there. Most people can hear 8,000. I mean, maybe if you're like 90, you probably can't anymore, but it was well within the audio range, so every now and again you could hear those tones. This is a picture of my favorite cart machine ever, and I used this particular model of cart machines in 3 stations. This is also an ITC, and this is called a 3D, and it's just like the SP we just looked at, except there are 3 decks here. They are completely independent from one another. As far as playback is concerned, you can have them come up on different channels on the board, and they can be considered as individual decks. Or you can wire these machines in such a way that it will combine the output of all 3 decks, and then it'll come up on one channel in the board. When these were popular was back in the 70s, when you still had the small rotary pot console boards that didn't have a whole lot of channels on it, and you would be able to like put 3 of these in the studio, and it would come up on 3 spots on the board, but then you'd have slots for 9 cart machines. Very cool indeed. This is an ITC 99B recorder. This was pretty much the top of the line Rolls-Royce cart machine of the 1980s. These were very popular in radio stations for recording through the 80s and 90s, especially if you were playing music. It's a very plain Jane looking box. The 99B player without the record electronics could be found in a lot of radio stations too. There were a lot of stations that wanted the absolute best sound, and these were available for both recording and playback, and they were not cheap. A recorder with the record electronics and set up and ready to go would set you back about $6,000 in 1980s money. So, wow. I'm trying to think of one of the stations that had these was WHTZ in New York in the mid 80s. They had the whole system here that was all 99B recorder and player, and boy did they sound good. Locally, when I grew up, WGH-FM, which was our big top 40, had these, and so did WNVZ Z104, and they were the 2 competing top 40 stations in my market, in the Norfolk market, Virginia Beach, Hampton Roads, and they both had ITC cart machines. So there was tight competition between those 2, and they both sounded very good on the air. This is a cart machine. This is the best picture I can find of this, and I apologize for the quality, but I cannot find a better picture than this. And I show this here because this machine was the last cart machine that I personally ever had anything to do with installing. In 1997, I went back to WFOS, not as a student, but as somebody who was an assistant engineer. I was doing some work. They were doing some major studio work. They were installing an automation system. And at that point in time, I had become very proficient in that. So I was hired to help. And one of the side jobs I did while I was there was to revamp one of the small production studios. And they actually bought new cart machines for this studio. These are Audicord cart machines. And this one is a DL series recorder from 1997. And I remember taking this brand new out of the box, taking the top off, carefully setting the dip switches to the operation that I wanted, because there were certain features these things could do, and putting this in along with a couple of players. And what a gorgeous machine it is. And it was a beautiful sounding machine as well. Let's talk about cartridge tape for a bit. These were my favorite cartridges in the 80s, sound-wise. I still think they sounded better than anything that came along after. It's funny, you could be on the phone with somebody working at a radio station anywhere in the country, and you could say, just offhandedly, what kind of cartridges do you use? Because there were 2 or 3 brands that made these cartridges, and all they would have to say is, they're blue. You knew exactly what they were talking about. This is an AudioPack AA4 on the left with SGS4 tape in it, which was very high bias tape. It's analogous to like chrome tape in a cassette. And then the AA3 was high output, low noise. These tapes both had the same sensitivity. And pretty much if you aligned your cart machines for the AA3, you could use the AA4. They were very close. The AA4 was a little better on the high frequencies. It was a crisper, brighter sound. And a lot of engineers at radio stations across the country just absolutely insisted on the AudioPack AA4. That was the cartridge of choice, and they wouldn't use anything else. This is its younger and older, well, its older brother. I was going to say its little brother, but it's its older brother. This is an AudioPack A2, which is a brand of cartridge by the same people, AudioPack by Capitol, and yes, the same Capitol that made EMI tape. It's all the same thing. These cartridges were loaded with the same tape stock that came in 8-track cartridges. And so therefore, they were not like the ones I just showed you. These were lower sensitivity, 160 nanoweber to be precise, for those of you who know what that means, whereas the high output tapes that we just looked at, they were 250 nanoweber tape. And those ITC machines that we were looking at, the ITC 99B recorder, came from ITC. They were aligned for these tapes. However, WTAR, which was a station I grew up listening to in Hampton Roads, and went to work for later. They had a lot of big studios. They had an AM and an FM, and they were trying to look for a way to save money because cart machines and the tape were expensive. So what they did is they bought the double A2 cartridge here, which it's a little known fact, but it works nicely with stereo, even though they're not supposed to. It's kind of like one of those, oops, it works really good for that. And they bought ITC machines and actually realigned them for the older 8-track stock 160 nanoweber tape. When I say 8-track, I'm talking about 8-track flashback, man. It was the same tape in these cartridges that Capitol put in their 8-tracks that you would go to the store and buy. They kept making that for years simply for radio. Okay? So here's an ad for the AudioPack cartridges. The A2 and the stereo-phased AA3 broadcast cartridge. The AA3, of course, had that hot tape in it, 250 nanowebers, and the AA2 was the old, standard tape for 8 tracks. Here's another look at a couple of cartridges. Once again, our AA2 here appears. It's the same one, but I had put it next to a Fidelipack cartridge. This is a Model 300, and this is kind of the oldest design of cartridge. It goes back to the 50s. The Fidelipack cartridge If you've ever played with any of that technology, that it jumps out at you and you go, yeah, I've seen that before. These cartridges were originally designed, the Fidelipack on the left, for mono use. They were not really designed for stereo. Early cart machines, before stereo cart machines came along, had 2 tracks on the tape. You had the audio track and the cue track. And in the middle there was just a big guard band to keep the cue track audio from getting into the audio itself, so you didn't hear the tones. And then when they came along with stereo machines, all they did was add a track to the middle and make that the right channel. So mono cart machines were not compatible with stereo cart machines. However, you could play a mono cart in a stereo cart machine, you would just hear it in the left channel. So, yeah. The other thing about cart machines is they had no erase heads. So what you had to do was either get a bulk tape eraser and erase the cartridge, or that was it. Actually, if we skip back here to the 99B recorder, this machine had an eraser in it. It was located under the deck. If you can see the mouse pointer, it was actually under here. And you would place a card in there, and there's a button that you can barely see here. And if you push that, and you push the right sequence of buttons over here, it would erase the cartridge, and then it would align the heads for the cart machine to the cartridge so that they were exact. You had to make sure your playback head was in perfect alignment in your recorder with all of the machines in the building. That wasn't really hard to do. So that was your reference. And then when it would set the azimuth on the tape heads, it would be absolutely perfect for whatever cartridge you could put in it. These were amazing machines. They could do all kinds of crazy stuff like that. Now, these cartridges were the last introduced as the technology progressed, and these came along in the 80s. These are Scotch carts. Later, the ITC people bought this brand out completely, and they started making them themselves, and they were called ITC carts. To be precise, these are Scotch Cart 2s. These have the same sort of high bias tape as the AA4 SGS cartridges do, the SGS I just showed you, and they were cross-compatible enough where you could actually have mixed tapes in your studio. You could either use these or those. If you set your cart machines for the AudioPack AA3, that seemed to be the high output standard, and you could get away with using a lot of different tapes because like Fidelipack themselves had the MasterCart series, MasterCart 2, that was compatible with the AudioPack, and then later on they had the Dynamax with Cobalt tape in it, which was really expensive but sounded really, really, really good. They did really, if you were going to use nothing but that tape, you probably would have wanted to tweak your machines because it was a little bit crisp on the high end, but it seemed to me that the industry had pretty much settled at that point that everything was going to be compatible with this blue cartridge, on the dark blue cartridge here on the right for the machines in the 80s. The advantage to the Scotch carts is actually quite easy to see. There are no pressure pads anywhere in the cartridge. Tape tension is provided by a spring, and that is adjustable. You can actually, if the tape gets too tight after several plays, you can loosen it up a little bit, or if it loosens up, which sometimes would happen, you can always just adjust the tension. And according to the literature, you'd have to do that every 300 plays. So I put this in here because you just cannot talk about playing music on the radio in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s without talking about this technology, because this is where a lot of it came from. Really big radio stations like KHJ in Los Angeles, I know that they had a lot of music on cart back in the 60s, and WABC in New York were actually using cart machines long before a lot of other stations did. Mostly the way it worked is that there would be some combination of carts and records, like, for instance, kind of the old way of doing top 40 is that you would put the hot records on cartridge, and that saved the records from being handled. Being in a radio station, you got to think, a top 40 station, if it's a hot song, might play that song every 3 hours. That's a lot of plays. And it's not necessarily the plays that wears out the record, it's the handling of the record, okay? It's putting it on the turntable and queuing it up. We'll talk about back queuing in a little bit here. And this was hard on records, and those records, those studio records, would only last maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and they'd have to be taken off the air. They'd have to get a clean copy. So when cartridges became where they sounded good, the early machines really just didn't have the fidelity. They were great. They were okay for commercials and short little things, but not music and that sort of thing. Later on, as the technology progressed and it got better, radio stations would take your hot songs and put them on cart, and then you'd have your turntables there to play your oldies, right? And a lot of stations like WGH, which was a station I grew up listening to. We're going to see some pictures of GH coming up. And they would, when I was a kid at night, you'd listen to the radio, and they would have the short version from the cartridge, on the cartridge. Like the 45, they would put it on the cartridge. And then at night, they'd bust out the album, fire up the turntable, and play you the long version because they had the time to do it. And so that was kind of cool. I remember talking to Jim Stewart, who was program director at WGH in the 70s when I was listening, and I asked him, I said, was that something that y'all sat around and talked about? And he said, no, it just sort of happened. At night there was more time, and the guys on at night, he said, I trusted their taste. And so at night on WGH, like during the day, you would hear the short version, and then American Pie, for instance, they actually played an edit during the day, and then at night, you'd hear the whole 8 minutes and 30 seconds. They'd roll the whole thing, or Nights in White Satin, that sort of thing. So it was a combination of these two technologies working together back in the 70s. By the time the 80s came along, the turntable in the studio was sort of going away. You would have one because radio shows would come in on turntables. And that's or come in on records that you would play on a turntable. Let me get that straight. The records like American Top 40 with Casey Kasem came in on records, and you would play them back on the air when it was time to do the show. Those are called electrical transcriptions, radio transcriptions. By the time the 80s came along, they were regular LPs, but they have a very different start. So I wanted to take a little bit and talk about the cart machines because they're so important. And here is a picture I have of a couple of beautiful ITC 3Ds together. Very cool indeed. Before we move on and go to records, I do have to touch on the fact that CD was a thing that came along in the 1980s, and this was one of the first CD players that ended up in radio stations. This is Technique's PG-1200, top-loading CD player, professional CD player, built like a freaking tank, and you can still buy them. They made this machine for a very long time, and they were made well into the 90s. They're still around, and I would love to have one. Techmoan has one. He's done a video about how cool they are. These are wonderful machines, and this particular machine that you're seeing is in the production studio at WTAR AM 790 in Norfolk. Yes, the same dial position as WAKY. And this was the first commercial radio station that I ever worked at. And at this time, in the 80s, this machine existed to take music from CD and put it on cartridge. WTAR did not play CDs on the air. And in the 80s, and even well into the 90s, a lot of radio stations did just that. They took a CD, they put it in the machine, they dubbed it over to a cartridge, and they used the cartridge on the air. The reasons were many. First of all, the beautiful thing about putting things on cart was that you could get the edit that you wanted. You could do your own editing. You could tighten up the starts. That wasn't necessarily easy on a CD, or obtaining a CD with the edit that you wanted to play, that sort of thing. You could also do, like at WTAR, for instance, at the end of the song, they would force the fade, so it was always the logical place to start the next thing would be at 5 seconds. So you'd look at a cartridge and it would say, the time on the label would say 3:25, 3:30. It was always right there. So you could just sit there, and it was faded in such a way that you could do that. Of course, if the song was ice cold, they wouldn't cut it off, but you know what I mean. So it was these nice tight little things that they put on cart. Then these machines came along. These started to get popular in the late 80s. The first time that I ever saw one was at Z104 in Norfolk, WNVZ, and they were on the air there alongside of their cart library, and they were mixing them in. So these things started to show up, and now we have a situation where we're playing some of the music off cart and some of it off CD. In the late 80s, you were still in a situation where the record companies were not sending out promos on CD a lot. They were still sending out records, and what we would do is get the record. If we were going to play it on the air, you would run into the studio, you'd put it on a card, it would have a number, they'd say, here, take this song, put it on a cartridge. It was my favorite job to do, was to make libraries to cart. But this was an attempt to make playing CDs on the air better. And, of course, the CDs themselves were in these protective caddies. This is a Denon 951 FA CD player. Or is this a 950? I'm going to have to zoom in to see that. Let's see what this is. I don't want to be wrong. No, this is a 950 FA, so this is the original. The 951 was a little skinnier. It was a kind of a skinnier cabinet. But anyway, they all worked exactly the same way. You take your CD, you put them in the case, and then you slide the whole case in. The whole caddy went in. And that way you never touch the disc, see? And, if somebody was smoking in the studio, you don't get smoke all over your discs. If you drop it, they were screwed into those cases. The case would break, not the CD. You couldn't scratch it. The big problem with playing CDs on the air, from their cases naked, was that people were handling them. They would drop them. They would scratch them. They'd get messed up. And, your expensive CD library gets messed up. Although a lot of stations did that, like the original Sony CD players on the air, where for the broadcast, like the Sony CDP 3000, they were just like home CD players. They had drawers on them and all that stuff. That's enough about CDs and carts and all that. But I wanted you to understand that the technologies went hand in hand. Records on the radio continued up until about 2000, and at that point everything was pretty much switched to digital. But most radio stations, for obvious reasons, would keep a turntable around. So this is your typical broadcast turntable setup from the 1980s. This is a Technics SP25. It appears here that somebody has made their own plinth out of a piece of wood so they could have it on a table. That's perfectly acceptable. These machines would usually be mounted in a countertop, as I showed you in the video earlier, and these are considered by many people to be the reference standard record player, period. The tone arm that you're looking at is very special. That is a gray microtrack tone arm. That design goes back to the 60s. It is made of a wood laminate, and the counterweight on the rear of the cartridge is fixed. You can't change that. It doesn't slide up and down. You can't change the weight. The way that you set the tracking force on a gray microtrack arm is to take that head shell, and above the cartridge you put little brass weights in it until you get it to where it will track at the proper tracking force that you're looking for. And we'll talk about cartridges and tracking forces later. It's a very ingenious way of doing that, because the beautiful part is that those head shells just unplug. There's not a screw to take off. They literally just come off the end of the arm. You pull them and that's it. And so if you want to play like an old 78 or a transcription disc that you need a different stylus for, you could just plug that in and boom, you were good to go. These tone arms were used on the radio well into the 90s. Well into the 90s with these Technics SP25s. They had the SP15 too, which was a little bit different. It had a digital display on it. The 25 here did not. It had a strobe, and it had a speed control next to the strobe, and then I believe this is a 33 and a 45, but some of these machines would do 78 if you pushed both buttons. So I'm not real sure if these are set up to do that or not. But the 25, this is the first one that I ever used, was the 25. Matter of fact, while I'm looking at this picture, let's see if we have enough resolution, because I want to see something. Okay, what is the switch here? The switch is power, and we have 45 and 33. Okay, just double checking. That switch was messing with my brain there for a minute. I was like, wait a minute, aren't those the speed buttons above the start-stop? Yep. So the correct way to use a broadcast turntable is when you play a record on the air, you put the record on, and then you pick the tone arm up and you put it on the record with the record playing. You don't want to put a tone arm on a record when the record is still. Make sure the record is running. And then you listen in Q, which is a special channel on the board that doesn't go out over the air, so you can hear what's going on with the turntable, until the song starts. You find the beginning of where you want the record to start. And then you hit the stop button there, the start-stop button, to stop the turntable. And so it goes like that. Now, you are carefully move the platter back a half turn. When you are ready to play it back on the air, you now hit the start button and turn the fader up, and there's your song playing. There's a little bit of a delay there. You have to kind of get used to that. Most people do. The problem with doing that is that if you do it too quickly, or if the tone arm is not set up properly, or if you have a terribly worn stylus, that will damage a record, especially a polystyrene 45. You must do this with the utmost care. If you're a record collector, you may have gone to buy records and they come out of radio stations, and you'll hear what's known as Q-burn on the records. Q-burn is the damage caused by repeatedly back-cueing a record. And like I said, you do it carefully, it won't cause any problems, especially with a good cartridge that's designed to do it. It won't be an issue. One of the things that you learn pretty much early on is that if you're in a situation where you are going to start a record under yourself while you're talking, that you don't do a tight cue on it. You just put the needle down and then you get close to it, and then you start the turntable under where you're talking, and you hear it as it comes up when the song starts. And that will make it so you don't have to back cue. There's a lot of tricks that broadcasters learned how to do through the years to be able to play a record in such a way that you didn't have to back cue it. One of the things that is very old school, going way back to the 40s, is what's called a slip cue. And that is where you let the turntable run and you hold the very edge of the record to hold it in place. You have cued it to exactly the beat that you want it to start at, and then when you're ready for it, you let it go. Of course, hip-hop DJs know all about that, and people in discos and whatnot. That's called a slip cue. That is also rough on your records. But that's why a lot of the old broadcast turntables had very soft felt on the turntable itself, was so that it would slide easily under it. So this is the turntable at WTAR. If you can imagine, there's a chair in between this and the CD player I showed you a little while ago. This is just a good old-fashioned Technics SL1200, and behind that you'll see an ITC B99.9 cart machine. B99.9, that's the radio station I worked at. The cart machines are 99Bs. I work at B99.9. Sorry, I say that too much and my brain went crazy. That sentence is going to look weird in the captions. Anyway, behind that you will see there's a cart machine, and then we have this turntable here. The cartridge on this turntable is none other than a Shure V15 4 with I think it's a high track stylus on it. You can't really use the brush for back cueing, so there was a stylus that you could put on those. This turntable was not designed to be directly on the air. This turntable was designed to take music from records and put it on cartridge. That's why it lived and existed. And it's one of the reasons that WTAR sounded good. And they also had these 99B machines, and they used that low sensitivity old Ampex tape, and they pushed it. The Ampex tape in the Fidelopec carts and the Capital tape, the EMI tape in the Audio Pack carts, they would push it a little bit. Oh my God, they sounded good on the air. Anyway, sorry. It's just a very fond memory. I was very happy to be able to work there. Let's look just at a little bit of history here about this. Let's kind of take a step back and talk about where all this comes from. Records on the radio, of course, like the first guy that ever broadcast his voice on the radio played a record, I think. I don't remember the guy's name. There's so many different stories, you know. They usually say it's Guillermo Marconi who did the first broadcast, and I don't know. I don't even, not even going to go there. But they all talk about playing a record on the air, you know. Well, records on the radio weren't just the old shellac 78s. In the 1920s, when they were working out how to do sound with film, the first system that they came up with was called Vitaphone. And Vitaphone, if you watch really old sound movies like on Turner Classic Movies or whatever your favorite classic movie channel is, from the late 20s and early 30s, you will see the name Vitaphone. And that means that they were using this system where, as the scene was recorded, they were recording onto wax these great big 16-inch records that ran at 33 1/3 RPM. The Vitaphone system, by the way, in that form didn't last very long, just a couple of years. They never could quite get it right, so what they ended up going for in Hollywood was they did sound on film with optical recording, which is a completely different ballgame. And Technology Connections has a wonderful video showing how that works. But the Vitaphone system, came along, and radio took a look at it and went, that's a big record. And it runs at 33 1/3 RPM. Gee, how much audio do you think we could get on that record? And they refined it a little bit and then got it to where they could get about a half hour on a side. And not only would they use these records to distribute radio shows, but radio stations themselves would have the lathes to record them. And they would record things, let's say, off of a network for delayed broadcasting. Or they would record whole shows and then play them back later. Or commercials or anything. This, before tape, was what radio was about, was playing records on the air. I don't know who the lady is holding the record. It's just a picture I found online. But it's a good reference to see how big a 16-inch record is. You know what I mean? Here's a guy working in a plant that they're pressing these records. In the 40s, one of the reasons that we have high-fidelity records, by the way, in the 40s, they had the Victory discs that they were sending overseas. These were radio shows for soldiers serving overseas in the United States. They went out on pure vinyl 16-inch records like this, and or 12-inch records. And the thing about them is the reason why they were vinyl was it doesn't break. Well, vinyl is also a lot more quiet than the original shellac records. If it's a record that you're recording yourself, like you have a lathe in the radio station and you're recording a commercial or something like that, that uses acetate or lacquer, just like they record the masters for records today. It's the same technology, except instead of sending the record off to be plated and then stamped, you just play back the record. So those are generally known as acetates or transcription discs if they're this big. So here's a picture of the WGH production studio, one of them in 1960. Nobody knows who these people are, so we can't tell you. I think, well, actually, it may be on the website. I'm not sure. By the way, this comes from a great website that is put on by Dale Parsons. Dale Parsons is an alumnus of WGH and also worked as the operations manager at WTAR. He was gone by the time I got to work at WTAR in the late 80s. He had moved on to be the program director at WNBC in New York. Yes, sir. So Dale was really honestly somebody that influenced me a great deal. I kind of wanted to follow in his footsteps. I didn't get as far as he did, but it's still very cool. Anyway, this is a picture of people doing a commercial live in the studio at WGH. And you will see that not only do we have an Ampex tape recorder there, we have a very early cart machine here. Let's zoom in and take a look around. This is a pretty crisp picture. There's an early cart machine here. And then over here we have a few cartridges. And this is a tape recorder here. It's got 7-inch reels on it. Very interesting. And then over here you'll see that we have a lathe. This is for recording acetates, recording original records to be played back on the air. And then over here we have some 16-inch Gates turntables for playing back records in this production room. And then this would be an Ampex tape recorder over here. And the microphone, I believe, is a Shure. The board behind them is an RCA. For these WGH pictures, by the way, I will put a link to the webpage. Dale may have identified these folks, but I don't know who they are. I know we don't. I think what it was is that we couldn't figure out who the guy was, but we know who the lady is. So anyway, you can go look that up if you want to. This is another picture of the WGH control room in, this would have been 1975 abouts. At that point in time, you'll see that they had 3 Gates BC500 turntables with what appear to be Microtrack tone arms on them. Microtrack, the gray Microtrack tone arms. And we have 3 machines in here. And you would have 3 machines because I believe that the morning man, George Crawford, insisted on it because he would usually play some music from this one and he would have sound effects on this machine. I've seen pictures where he had albums with sound effects, and he used a lot of cartoon audio like Hanna-Barbera. He had a deal with them. George had done some voice work for Hanna-Barbera, and he got all of these records with cartoon voices on it, and he used to use it on the air. So he needed a turntable to be able to do that. He also had a really nifty record weight on top of that turntable, which was awesome. This is Rob Wayne on the air at WGH, and I'm pretty sure that's Rob Wayne. Yeah, it's Rob Wayne. And this would have been in the early 70s, 74 maybe, at the Military Circle Studios. And once again, we see these Gates BC500 turntables. They were awesome. And if you look really closely over here, if you like zoom like way in, you'll see that is a Shure cartridge, which I was unaware that WGH used. And the Shure cartridge is probably like an M447 or something like that. And you can tell, I can tell just by the shape looking at that. So this is Bob Calvert. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned Bob being a big influence on Wolfman Jack. Well, here's Bob on the air at WGH. This was in 1964. And this was the main control room. And we have, once again, 2 Gates turntables. I don't know what kind of tone arms those are. If anybody can tell me, let me know. And Bob is playing records on the air. At this point in time, WGH was not putting music on cartridge. The studio in the 70s, you saw the big 5-spot cart machine there. That's called a Broadcast Electronics 5-spot. They were playing some of their music off of cartridges at that point. And as the 70s progressed, they were playing more and more, especially during the day. But at night, we still had those turntables rolling. And you see Bob has 2 of those peculiar top-loading cart machines on either side of him. And the cartridges are definitely Fidelipac Model 300s, although I've been through some of the cartridges that came out of WGH in the 60s, and I can tell you that they were also using original Audio Pack cartridges. That would have been like the A1 back there a long time ago. So this is the turntable that we've been seeing at WGH, and these are just fantastic turntables. And one of the questions was, were there any turntables that were used into the 80s? And the answer was yes. These guys right here. You could still get the replacement idler wheels. These are rim-driven turntables. They have big motors. These are known as quick start turntables, okay? And to change speeds, it's a gear shift, as you can see. We'll see more about that here shortly. And then you have the felt top, and then you have the little things that pops up so you can put the 45 on, and you don't have to have a center adapter. You just put it on there and you can play it. This machine is a BC500. It's designed to play 12-inch discs. This is not a transcription version. A transcription version of this machine was bigger, and I've actually seen one and used them with the 16-inch turntable. Very similar to what Dr. Johnny Fever was using in an earlier picture there on the picture from WKRP. The tone arm on this is an early gray tone arm, and it dates back to the 1950s. I do not know the number off the top of my head for this arm. It is made out of magnesium. You would look at it and you would say to yourself, that's a heavy arm. It's actually quite light, but it is certainly not what we would consider a low mass tone arm today. Most turntables today that you can buy have medium mass arms. They're looking for cartridges that track between 1.5 and about 3 grams, and that works nicely with the arm. These cartridges were designed, or these arms rather, were designed to work with cartridges that would track somewhere between 3 and 6 grams. If you have a gray tone arm, one of these early ones, and you try and put a cartridge on it that tracks at like 1.5, it's not a good match and it won't sound good. You really need to have a cartridge that is designed to track maybe I think you can get away with 3 grams. As far as anti-skate is not anti-scape, but anti-skate, as in not skating, is concerned, the gray tone arms are viscously damped. So instead of having a bearing, it actually floats in this viscous fluid, which provides the anti-skate force on the arm. There's no adjustment. It just happens. Whatever your downward tracking force is, it changes the viscosity of that fluid as it tracks across a record. They are ingenious tone arms and very well made and very, very good sounding. The Microtrack, the laminated wooden, got its name because it was designed to work with stereo records, and you can track cartridges as low as like 2 grams with one of those, no problem, and it will track nicely. Although most radio station turntables tracked a little higher than that. We'll talk more about that as we roll on. Here's one of my favorite broadcast turntables that I actually used in a radio station. My internship while I was still at school at WFOS was at a little radio station in a little town called Berea, Kentucky. There's a famous college there. My brother was going to school there in the summer of 1988, and I carried my butt out there and stayed with him and worked at the local radio station. And they had 2 QRK turntables in there, and I got to use those. I loved them. And then later on, I actually bought one of these turntables. Now, you'll notice the QRK has a well that a 45 goes down into. So you never have to worry about changing it. You can play a 12-inch, you can play a 10-inch, and just put it on the turntable and you're done. There's a big gear shift on the front, you'll see, and this is how you would select your speed. These are 3 speed tables, 33, 45, and 78. And there's a little speed adjuster next to the numbers here, right next to the gear shift, where you can tweak the speed a little bit. You get a strobe disc, it would be the way to do it, and then you can dial these things pretty much right on. The drive on these turntables, they're rim-driven turntables, so they have a very heavy plinth that rides in an oil bath bearing. And the motor on the Gates BC500 and the QRKs and the Ruscos, there were several companies made turntables like this, but I really like the QRKs. The motor could pull your boat out of the water. It was huge. It was a giant AC synchronous high torque motor, and that's why these machines were known as quick start turntables. I was describing using a Technics SP25 to play a record on the air. These guys, you move that record back a quarter turn, that was plenty. It would come up to speed well in that time. So they were known as, like I said, Quick Start, and also had a brand name attached to them, Q-Master. Wonderful turntables. I bought one of these turntables. And mine kind of looked like this. Somebody had one and they were selling it with a custom-made plinth. This one is in what's called a road box, where you have a box that you can set on a countertop somewhere and use. These machines were really designed to be mounted in a countertop that usually would be isolated from where everything else was. Sometimes you could put them in these big countertops. They could roll around and just plug them in if you needed to. The one that I bought was just too much fun to play with, and I can't find a picture of it or I'd show you. But the one I had a Shure tone arm on it that was less expensive than the gray Microtrack here, but it was a little more friendly to if you were like a novice working at home, because you set the anti-skate, and it was spring-loaded. It was a spring that set the tracking force, and it also set the anti-skate. So it was a real easy tone arm to work with, and works beautifully with these turntables. If I ever find another one of these things, I'm going to buy it. But every time they come up, they are just unbelievably expensive. These things go for well north of $1,000 if you can find one in good working condition. Let's talk about the cartridges that were used on the air, and the name that comes up is Stanton. Stanton made professional phono cartridges. Stanton was an offshoot of Pickering. Pickering came first. And then they started the Stanton line of cartridges, which was, they were like two companies that worked right together. Pickering was considered to be the audiophile line for home use. Stanton cartridges, on the other hand, were the workhorses in the radio industry, at discos, or record companies. Anybody that needed reliable professional playback of a record, either for playing it for other people or just whatever. And they made cartridges that were very, very good. They were very flat, very clean sound, very warm cartridges, especially the broadcast cartridges. And I have videos up about this. The basic one was the Stanton 500. The 500 goes back at least to the 60s, maybe even 60s is when it goes back to. And it is a very rugged cartridge, and it got to be very popular in radio stations because it was just tough. It sounded good, and it could be very delicate with the sound, but it was ruggedly built, and they were hard to break. And the styli were easy to replace. You could just hand the stylus to any old jock and say, pull it out and put it in. Boom, there you go. Usually in a lot of radio stations, there would be an emergency stylus somewhere in the studio that you could just pull it out, so everybody knew how to change these things. This is a later version of the Stanton that came along in the late 70s or early 80s. This is the 500 Mark II. I've done a whole video about this cartridge, and this is the Broadcaster series. This particular cartridge was designed for on-air playback, and unlike the heavier tracking Stanton 500, usually those cartridges the Stanton 500s tracked between 2 and 5 grams, depending on how you set them up and what the tone arm you used was. So they would work nicely with like a high mass arm like the old gray tone arm. I want to say that was a 308 model. Now, we're talking about the big magnesium arm I showed earlier. I want to say that's a 308. That keeps knocking at the back of my head, but I'm not sure if that's correct. So I'm just throwing it out there. If anybody knows what it is, put it down below. Anyway, the Stantons would work with that, and they were designed to play microtrack, micro-grooved records. And we're talking about 45s and LPs. And they were stereo cartridges. Back in the day, the stereo cartridges were wired in mono. After stereo came along, you would take that cartridge and wire it up in mono, even in like an AM station. And that way you were backwardly compatible with mono and stereo records. Earlier cartridges for radio were mono only. And you may have heard of like the GE VR series. They had mono and stereo versions. But by the time the Stantons came along, they were stereo, and what the engineer would do is just simply wire it to mono. Anyway, the Stanton 500 series tracks a little lighter. These guys can track at 1.5 grams, but 1.75 seems to be about right. I've got one that sounds very, very good. And the only problem with the 500 series these days is that finding styli for these cartridges, any of them, is dang near impossible. There's a lot of aftermarket garbage out there, but it doesn't sound good. Really, the cartridge of choice when FM started to get big in the 70s was this guy right here. This is the Stanton 680EL, which is an elliptical stylus, a 0.4 by 0.7. I call that a fat elliptical because it really is. And these guys also, like the earlier Stanton 500s that could track 2 to 5 grams, had the same spec. And you're probably saying, well, how did you know what tracking force to put these at? Well, let me tell you how they did it back then. They would set up a turntable, and they would bust out a test record, and they would bring in an oscilloscope. These are the engineers. And they would watch the waveform on an oscilloscope playing back specific test tracks to make sure that there was no mistracking. And they would basically set the tracking force by the sound of it. Now, after doing this for a while, you kind of know where you're going to be. So, for instance, the 680EL tracks beautifully at 3 grams. Yes, that's heavier than like a hi-fi turntable, but it is not going to damage records. And you must remember that in a radio environment, especially if you're playing live on the air, you really need to have solid tracking force to move any schmutz that's on the record out of the way. It also has to keep the groove. You want a little higher tracking force, and the tone arms that we've been looking at are looking for higher mass anyway. So if everything is tuned up properly, these cartridges, there's a lot of people out there that think, oh my God, if you track something at 3 grams, you're going to tear up their... No, it's not how it works. That's not how it works at all. It has to do more with the cartridge being set up properly and aligned properly, and with the microtrack arms and the other arms, that was very, very much the case. They were properly aligned, bare-walled across the record. And you would do that by placing the arm in the right place. When you would build the plinth, you would drill the hole for the arm. You'd make the proper measurements. You knew where that was from the spindle, and you could get it dead on for the arm. And there was no adjustment because once you set it up, it didn't change. That's how it was supposed to be. So, yes, these are my favorite cartridges of all time. I have a Stanton 680EL on one of my turntables that has a specialty stylus from Stanton, the 6807, which is a conical stylus that is designed to play back 45s and mono LPs, but still be compatible with stereo. And I use that turntable exclusively almost for playing back 45s. And the other cartridge that I have is a Stanton 680EE, which was not designed for broadcast use, and it's a high-fidelity version of it. But one could use the Stanton 680EE, for instance, in the production room to make copies from records to cartridges. And a lot of people did that with the EEs and the Stanton 681s as well. You just had to be extra careful. You would remove the stabilizer brush, and you'd set up that tone arm very carefully, and you could make these absolutely incredible sounding tapes from records to play back on the air that had all the fidelity of a very, like a light tracking 0.3 by 0.7 stylus, but you weren't beating the crap out of it in the studio. The EL was the best of both worlds. The EL could be used in the production room. It's very detailed. It sounds wonderful, and it sounds great on the air. And when I was at WFOS, these were the cartridges we had on the air, and that was a classical station that played jazz. And I can tell you that those were some of the finest sounding turntables that I ever worked with. So I have just... I tried just about every phono cartridge under the sun, boys and girls, and I talked about them on this channel for years, and I spent a lot of money. But I came back to Stanton in the last few years, and I don't run anything else. No Audio Technicas. I do have a very high-end Audio Technica that may go back into service somewhere down the road. So the question that has to be asked is, can you still get this equipment to play back records on the air at a radio station today? Yes. No problem about it. You see, this ad is from a Stanton brochure, and it's showing a man working at a discotheque. You know, like disco. Get out there and boogie. And it's for the Model 680EL, which we were just looking at, and it shows him using this at a disco. And I believe those are Stanton turntables in the picture. They're Stantons for sure. I don't know what this is all Stanton equipment because it was a Stanton ad. I'm sure that little board in the middle is Stanton as well. This is a DJ setup, like I said, for a disco. And then that makes you think automatically of a hip-hop DJ, right? Well, hip-hop, scratching them records, as much as that Bugs audiophiles kept the industry alive when people walked away from records and they weren't buying them at home. That segment of the market continued. And while Shure and Stanton are technically no longer around, I think Stanton is actually still in business, sorta, kinda. They were bought by the Gibson Music Corporation that makes Gibson guitars, and they haven't done anything with it for years. There are still cartridges out there made by Ortophone that are could be used on the air quite easily. They have the S series cartridges. The Concord DJS is a good one. Could be used with any standard S-shaped tone arm, as in a Technics turntable. And then, of course, Audio Technica also has DJ grade cartridges out. And the difference is a stronger cantilever and a little bit of an extra tracking force. And if you really look at it hard and think about it, you could get a Audio Technica 3600 L, which stands for low compliance. Those cartridges track at 3 grams, and they sound wonderful. And the styli are very, very easy to get. So if you were in a situation where you wanted to play records on the air on a consistent basis, you could do that and not, break yourself, because if you're playing records 24 hours on the air, you're going to have to replace your styli probably about once a month, right? So, yeah, no, it still exists. The way we have the way that the turntables were set up, the gates, the Stantons, you had a preamp that was right under the turntable. You'd have the wires came off the tone arm, standard RCA plugs and a ground, went to the preamplifier that was under the turntable mounted in the same cabinet. And then that preamplifier would usually send balanced audio out to the board or wherever you wanted it to go. And it was all a contained unit, and you could move it around. So that technology still exists. There are plenty of great outboard preamps that will do exactly that job. I don't know how many they make now that put out a balanced output, like the Stanton preamps that I saw in radio stations in the 80s and 90s, but it does exist, okay? You can figure out how to make this work. If you can get line level out of the turntable, you can plug it into a board. It's not that big of a deal. Matter of fact, there are a lot of turntables out there that have nice built-in preamps. So there you go. Audio Technica definitely makes turntables that you could use for on-air use, although I don't think their quality is up to it. I think you probably would be having to go get yourself one of the new Technics SL1200s, because they have the same features as the other SL1200s. You may still use like an Audio Technica cartridge on it, like a 3600 or the, I think it's the AX series, the AX2, or the, whatever it is, that is for disc jockey use. You still may use those cartridges because they're rugged and cheap, but you would really like to have a nice turntable. Or you could just see if you could dig up one of these ones that I showed you and get it up and running and put that on the air. The old rim drive turntables were funny. We were talking about the QRKs and the gates. The gates had very low rumble. They were very well designed. The QRKs, on the other hand, they had a little bit more rumble, especially if the idler was not new. And the one that I had, while it wasn't to the point of being annoying, I still have tape somewhere that I have recorded off of that machine. And when you can definitely hear the rumble of the turntable running. So that's one of the reasons that they were kind of phased out. And then you saw the Technics SB25s take over. Of course, there's always the original SB10, which was another Technics turntable that required you to have a plinth and a tone arm. And I've actually seen those before. We didn't mention them in the video. So I hope you found this interesting and fun, boys and girls. I know it's kind of a long ramble, and I just didn't feel like scripting it. I thought maybe we would just kind of ramble on about it. And like I said in the beginning of the video, if you grew up in the 20th century, you heard records on the radio. It took a long time for records to get out of radio stations. People seem to think for some reason that the CD appeared and then boom, all the records disappeared. It did not work that way. It took a long, long time for that to happen. Record companies were still sending records to radio stations in the late 90s. And especially when you're talking about R&B and hip-hop, they were still coming in and they were still getting put on cartridge or dumped directly into a digital automation system to get played on the air. It really was not until about the year 2000 when the turntable completely left the radio station, because now all of the audio was delivered from somewhere else. So the first time that I walked in a radio station without a turntable was in 2005. I actually worked at a station that did not have any cart machines, any reel-to-reel tape recorders, or any turntables. It was all digital. Except I did have to bust out some cassette decks because I had some shows, especially religious shows that we'd run on Sunday, that came in on cassette at that time. That format would just not die. These days, everything is delivered digitally. Everything. And very few things come in physical form. Like nowadays at the radio station that I work at now, I will download a file from a record company site, which is a high-res file. It's not an MP3 or an AA, whatever, what is it, AAC. It's not an MP4. It's nothing like that. It is a WAV file, and that's what will go on the air. Not available to the general public, don't you know? Makes me feel special. I will put a link in the description to the video for the radio station that I work at currently. I don't make any extra anything if you listen to it. It's just there. I work Monday through Friday at this point, 7 to midnight Eastern U.S. time. We're on Eastern Daylight Time now, so you'll have to convert that wherever you are. And if you go to the radio station's website and you click Listen Live during those hours, you should hear my squeaky little voice playing country music, except on Friday night where we have Southern Fried Goodness. It's Southern Fried Friday, where we play classic rock, Southern rock, blues, and country and novelty tunes and mix it all up. So if that sounds like something you'd like to hear, you can check it out. It's in the description for the video. This video has been a lot of fun, and if you've made it this far, thank you for hanging out. I certainly do appreciate it. We'll do something soon. Bye, y'all.